Hello. So, for today's first lecture, it's going to be on gender differences. So, when thinking about gender differences, we have to think about the question of if gender differences are real or just from social influence. So, if you think about it in society, women tend to be taught to be passive, where men are taught to be more aggressive. And education research has shown that when young girls take initiatives in things like science or math, they tend to be discouraged by their teacher, but boys tend to be encouraged. While some argue, on the other hand, that there are brain differences between men and women. So there are people who do argue both sides of this argument. So the first thing I want to note is that gender and sex aren't the same thing. So gender is actually constructed by society, and it has to do with social and cultural influences, and as well as their take on what's masculine and feminine behavior. And then sex is biological and it basically just has to do with anatomy. It's nothing more than that. And then to briefly go over what a social construct is, these do vary based on the culture and location you're in. Basically, they're just arbitrary rules and expected behaviors, either based on sex, it could be based on religion, race, socioeconomic status, and basically they just develop as a result of human interaction. So, historically, in terms of gender, men have been viewed superior to women, and women tend to be oppressed in regards to things like their careers and in the past voting. Men have been the focus of history books. If you think about some of the most famous people in history you learn about, most are men. And women had to fight for things like the right to vote, they were told not to go into the workforce, and have been told not to pursue certain areas such as math and science. So, in terms of progress, we haven't progressed as much as society, I think, thinks we are. Um, so, this first graph was actually taken from a study where they actually asked men and women if employers should pay men and women the same salary for the same job. 65% of men said yes, 82% of women said yes. So, that's just something to notice there. And then in terms of leadership with CEOs, 6.4% are women, 93.6% are men. As well as with managers, there's a huge disparity between men and women as well. So, some researchers argue that there are brain differences between men and women. I linked a video on the left side that just talks about this a little bit if you're interested in reading or viewing a little bit more information. Um, but some questions can arise when we study male versus female brains. So, what about those who don't identify with a gender? And are these brain differences strictly biological, or have they developed over time due to societal influences? So typically in these studies, they're using adults or even just teenagers. And if you think about it, they've been taught all these societal things in terms of gender those past years. So that could contribute to why maybe the brain looks different. It might not just be that they were born different. So now I'm going to talk about gender differences and mental health. So, in terms of suicide by age, you can see with men, there's a huge increase as age increases, where with female, it actually dips down as age increases. So, a lot of researchers argue that this is because women tend to seek mental health assistance more than men do. So, that's why by the time they get to older age, they would resort to something like suicide because they haven't gone out and sought mental health care. So, as you can see with the two graphs, women tend to be diagnosed more often and tend to be diagnosed with things like depression or anxiety more often than men do. And like on the past slide, a lot of researchers argue that this is because women tend to seek out mental health care more than men do. And then in terms of the specific diagnosis, men tend to be diagnosed more with things like ADHD, schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder, and alcoholism, where women tend to be diagnosed more with things like major depressive disorder and anxiety, as well as bipolar. And then in terms of treatment, women tend to seek out health services and human services more than men do, where you can see by a small percentage, men actually seek out self help more. And again, that probably goes back to what I've talked about on the previous slides, how women tend to actually go for things like therapy and seek out mental health care, where men might internalize it more and think that they can just help themselves. Also, on the other graph, this shows they ask the question, does your partner know you take medication for your mental illness? And 50% of men said yes, where 72% of women had said yes. And again, that goes back to that stigma of seeking mental health help as well. So, why do we see gender differences in terms of mental health care? So, a lot of it has to do with the expression. A mental illness and how it's expressed looks different in everyone, even in the same gender. And there's also that stigma that men could be seen as weak if they're seeking out mental health care. There are a couple common stigmas associated with gender as well. So, men are more likely to get diagnosed with things like antisocial personality disorder and schizophrenia, and they tend to ignore mental illness until it becomes more life threatening, where women are more likely to seek professional help earlier on. And then, in terms of gender based mental illness research, there are some issues. So, basically, I would say 90% of them are gender normative, which basically means they're adhering to or reinforcing the ideal standards of masculinity or femininity. And they don't look at individuals who identify as non binary, so they don't identify with either gender, or those who are transgender. They can also be conflicting based on the sample group. So there's actually been instances where there's been two studies that look at the same thing, and one found that there are differences in terms of gender, and one found that there weren't differences. So, when it comes to gender based mental health research, what researchers now believe that should be focused on are basically just encouraging treatment for individuals and breaking down these gender stereotypes. So, instead of doing all these studies saying, men show this different than women, that's great to know, and we should know if individuals display certain symptoms differently. But we also should be breaking down those gender stereotypes as well, because that overall will help reduce stigma about mental illness. So that is everything for this week's lecture. Next week, we're going to be learning about sexuality and mental health. Your assignments, as usual, are your week 11 quiz and week 11 discussion board. And then your reading for this week is going to be the NAMI article, which is linked on Canvas.